When I was a child, my father was a grocery store manager. And so you can bet that when it was time for us to go to the grocery store, the entire trip, my mother would sit and talk to us about how we would behave as we went to the grocery store. We would not do this. We would not ask for that. We would have to stand near the cart. We would have to do all these things because this was my father's work, and we were not to embarrass him. Any of you ever received a similar conversation in your life? And I wasn't from a small town, but I kind of have a feeling that that's what it's like to grow up in a small town with all those eyes on you. Does that sound about right? Okay, so I've got some big eyes. That's what it is like. And so there was this way that we acted and that we had to behave as children of the manager. And so we got this warning, and we got told all of these sorts of things. And then as I got older, I learned a lot about my work ethic, and I learned a lot about life from my father, sharing stories of his work life. So sometimes those stories would be, this one employee never irons his or her uniform coming to work. Or, this employee is always late and then wants to know why he or she can't get promoted. So all of these sorts of things he would always kind of ingrain it on dependent upon what the employees of the day were doing. And that lesson started to develop the older I got into one that I'm thinking you probably have heard too. And that became, you're known by the company you keep. Oh, so you did hear this before. I remember one particular time that he had to let an employee go, and he hated doing that. And so, but he said, I should have known better when it came to hiring, because I saw when they came in to interview, they came in with a bunch of hooligans. And so hooligans became this kind of catch-all for things to avoid, because I was going to be known by the company I kept. And that tidbit served me rather well through my high school years, when I had friends that wanted to go and skip out on class to go have lunch somewhere and then come back later in the day. Well, I was going to be known by the company I kept. Or when other friends, my first job actually was at McDonald's. And so there was all sorts of, it was really wonderful at 15 because it opened me up to a whole world of people. And I got to make more decisions about being known by the company I kept. That phrase came to mind as I read our gospel passage because we encountered these disciples. Many of them were fishermen and were not like the people's top 100 living in Israel in the first century, right? These were not the top of the class guys necessarily. But they were hanging out with the biggest thing to hit Galilee in thousands of years, right? They're hanging out with Jesus. In fact, if you catch the beginning of our gospel lesson today, it says that Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there. Because what happened, folks, when Jesus entered into town? What happened? The paparazzi came, right? Everyone came. They brought their sick, they brought their hungry, they needed healing. We've heard story after story after story these last few weeks. When Jesus came to town, I just kind of think of like, Jesus Christ, right? And they're dancing with their palm fronds and all their scarves and 70s hippie stuff. Maybe it wasn't quite like that, but it was a big deal when Jesus came to this town. And so these disciples, who were mostly just fishermen from not the greatest, most well-to-do families, well, they were becoming known by the company they kept. And so in our passage today, they start arguing about, I'm better than you. I mean, you've been doing this, I'm better than you. Well, that's not true. But I could argue that if I wanted to, right? And so these disciples are arguing about who's the greatest. And so Jesus turns things on his head because that's what he does, right? And to make his point, to illustrate his point, Jesus grabs a child and says, whoever welcomes this one in my name not only welcomes me, but welcomes the one who sent me. Now, as a parent of 2 children in the year 2018, That doesn't seem like that radical of an idea because I only take my children places where they're welcome. Thank you, Salem Lutheran Church, for fitting into that mold. And truthfully, my world, it revolves around my children a lot more than I'd like it to. In fact, I've watched a lot of marriages dissolve because they never took time for each other as they took time focusing on their children. And there's a lot of days I don't really want to leave the house, I just want to sit home. But you know what? I promised my kids that they could have a sleepover with their friend because they haven't seen them in a long time, and I've got to run this one over to that activity and this one to that activity, and I wish we had more money, but we're spending all this money on all the activities, and my world kind of is revolving around my kids right now. So that paradigm doesn't quite fit. You see, when Jesus said this, children had a bit of a different place in society. And that was illustrated for us a lot last week when Maya Fondrose flew in from Port-au-Prince to talk to us about the work with the Haitian Timon Foundation. Did you hear him share that when he was a child he had been a Restavik, a child slave? Because his mother had a mental breakdown. He went to live with his grandmother and she passed away. And so when he was left without family, he went to go stay with an aunt in the city, from the countryside into Port-au-Prince. And she already had children. And so he became the slave. He wasn't sent to school. He slept on cardboard in a different part of the house. He didn't get the same meals that they got to eat, even though he was the one doing all the cooking and the preparing of the food. And for us, in a very child-centric society, we can't quite wrap our heads around that. But remember, desperate people have to do desperate things. And most of us haven't seen that kind of desperation in our lifetimes. And that's some of the desperation that they saw 2,000 years ago in the land where Jesus walked. You see, the infant mortality rate was only 30%. And by the time that they were teenagers, 60% of them had passed away. And most of them, by the time that they were 16 or 17, most of their parents were gone, if they were still alive. And so desperate people do desperate things. And so to be a child in that society, well, it wasn't like it is today. Because it was hard to know if your child was going to make it. And so the community responded in kind. And so Jesus grabs this one and brings it up and says, this is what it's like to welcome me. To welcome the one who can't help him or herself. To welcome the one that feels like a burden sometimes. To welcome the one that you're investing your love and your heart in, and you don't even know if they're going to make it. But as I've noted, that metaphor kind of breaks down in 2018 in Central Florida. And so I wondered, what is that like? Well, you know what we have a hard time, I think, accepting and loving and encouraging? I think we have a hard time welcoming the oldest among us. I think we drive past a lot of nursing homes that are in assisted living facilities on our ways that are filled with people that don't have visitors and don't know that they're loved. I think that the amount of lonely people in this world increases. Do you know that one of the highest rates of suicide is among the oldest in our population who feel helpless, have lived a long life, and have reached a point where they feel like they're a burden? And my friends, this is not the way that God designed it or intends it to be. I think that if Jesus were here today, he would welcome up and bring the least of these child slaves into his arms. And he would reach with the other and grab the oldest among us. And you know what's sandwiched in between those two? An entire lifetime. Because we've all been children. And good Lord willing, we'll all get to age. And everything in between is filled with joy and blessing and lots of mistakes. And that is who God has welcomed with his arms, and says that when we welcome all of that, we welcome him. And so I ask today, We're known by the company we keep, right, church? We've become a member of this family through the waters of baptism. We share in the Thanksgiving Eucharistic feast every week as members of family. And so if we're known by the companies that we keep and we look at the people that Jesus hangs out with, the least among us, then who is the company that we are to keep? And thanks be to God that we are kept in Christ's company, now and always. Amen.